Hey guys, how's it going? Kripparrian here. Today I want to give you guys a bit of a rundown on Wild Ladder versus Standard Ladder. You guys know this month I've been playing quite a bit of Wild Ladder and I ended up getting Legend with a combo control style druid deck involving many Malagooses. And since then, I've actually been playing quite a bit of Standard Ladder. Now, probably not as much as some of you guys, but I feel on the web right now there isn't that much content, that isn't that much review on the Wild Ladder system, while there's plenty of standard related content. So while this video is a bit more weighted on the wild opinion of things, you probably have a pretty good opinion of what standard is like already, so it should give you enough of a guidance on what you might like to play in the following months. So let's get to it here. Standard and Wild are very similar in many aspects, but they're very different in how they function. First off, the main similarities are the ladder is generally the same. The type of decks are also generally the same. There's certainly some new decks, some heavily modified decks, but a lot of standard does cross over into Wild, even though it doesn't seem like. Certainly, cards over time in Hearthstone are more powerful, their combos are more powerful, their synergies are more powerful. So a good example is we saw Aggro Paladin and Murloc Paladin and Rizaka's Priest and Q-Block on the top of the standard ladder. I think all four of those decks had significant representation in Wild Ladder during that same time period. Basically, people take those standard lists and add a few of the traditionally very powerful wild cards to them, thus making, some of the most powerful decks ever even that much more powerful. So your experience in Wild is going to be quite a bit different, but in the end, you will be playing a lot of the same combos, cards, and stuff as you will in Standard. Now, the main thing that I think is different is the swapping of these decks. So what I have noticed is most people who play on the higher end of Wild Ladder, they have a lot of cards. They have pretty deep collections, and if you don't, this might be a reason to hesitate. So what tends to happen, and what happened to me when I was playing my combo druid, most people were playing very much the standard decks, the one that I just mentioned, in fact. Most people in Wild Ladder, all the way through Legend, they were playing aggressive Paladin decks that were like 95% the same as standard. They were playing Rizaka's Priests, similar idea. They're playing Q-Block, and again, same idea. And my combo druid deck actually countered all of those decks. So it was very easy. I think I lost like one game going into like rank 10 or something. I was just crushing it. But then as the days started going by, all of a sudden I realized like 70% of ladder is playing Giants Warlock. And that type of shift just doesn't happen in Standard. In Standard, there are fewer possibilities, and most of the people that play Standard don't have as such a card pool to switch to the new super powerful deck. So what happens is, if someone's playing like Rizaka's Priest in Standard, and even if by the rare chance people discover an even more powerful deck, a lot of those Rizaka's players won't have the card pool to actually switch their deck. So what happens is change is a lot slower in Standard. I've spoken to people who just play Standard, like 8 hours a day for the last few years, and they actually think there's like no change whatsoever in Standard. That's probably a little bit of an exaggeration, but still, you get the idea. In Wild, it is so significant, you won't believe it, especially at the high ranks. Once you start approaching like rank 5, rank 4, rank 3, you will see like, you have Wild figured out, and then 2 days later, 70% of the people you encounter will be playing a completely new deck. So if you want to succeed in Wild, even though I was lucky and didn't have to change my deck, I just changed a few tech cards around that made the deck decent enough to beat a lot of these new decks I was facing. But if you want to play Wild long term, you probably do need a large number of the traditionally powerful cards to be able to switch between decks. I don't think it's realistic to play for a few weeks of Wild and play this exact same deck from the start to the finish and get to Legend rank. Most likely within that time period, something will change. But if you do have a really deep card pool in Hearthstone, I would say that's an advantage. The thing that you will notice immediately playing Wild is there are people playing a higher variety of decks, even though people do like to stick to what's good. And yeah, as I mentioned, like 70% of people switch to Giant Warlock in a matter of like 2 days in Wild Ladder. The other 30% were just doing their own thing. You're going to see a lot more variation in Wild Ladder, and it does start to die down. I think once you start playing Wild Ladder, you're at like rank 25, probably playing for the first time, you are going to be playing against people who just have some mediocre deck from like 2 years ago. Like someone's going to play Cthulhu Druid with no card released in the last 2 years. You know, that's what you can expect. Typically from rank 25 to rank, I don't know, I'd say 15-ish, it starts to die off completely, and it starts to kind of lower in frequency leading up to that rank. But from rank 15 on, you're going to still see a quite large variation of decks, and it is going to change as you play throughout the days, throughout the weeks. So you have to be prepared for that. You probably going in should be well aware of how to play at least a few different decks that cover different bases. So maybe you don't want to play 2 combo decks. Maybe you want to play, maybe you need to know a good combo deck. Maybe you need to know a good aggressive or tempo deck and have the cards for both, and maybe switch based on what people are playing that day. That's the game plan that you probably need to focus if you're playing Wild. In Standard, things don't change too much, and the progression is far more sudden. If you're playing Standard Ladder, now this is probably going to change to a decent degree with the ladder changes that are coming up in about a month, but honestly, I imagine it won't change a great deal, at least not right away. You're going to start facing net decks hit and miss right from the get-go. You might be playing rank 24, just coming back to Hearthstone after like 2 years off, and you're going to be playing against tier 1 net decks at that rank. And, it's not necessarily going to be the case, but I've played a lot of alt accounts. I tried to get the card back, and you need to get rank 20 to do so. So I've gotten rank 20 tons and tons of times over the years, roughly 4 times a month, actually. So I have very, very good experience on that, and I can tell you your chance of queuing into a tier 1 net deck between the ranks of 25 and 21 are roughly 50%. So that's very depressing, but most of those players aren't very good at it, though depending on the net deck, that might not matter. If you're up against like Rizaka's Priest and your opponent is really bad at the game, you'll actually probably win. But if you're up against Pirate Warrior and your opponent is really bad at the game, you'll probably win just as much as someone who's pretty good at Pirate Warrior, because those decks most of the time just play out, right? No big deal. So it can be very frustrating to play Standard Ladder because of the hit and miss queuing system based on actual new players between the low ranks and people who play tier 1 net decks. And as you progress, I think once you're past rank 20, there are no new players in Standard. In Wild, there might be a few, but typically even the new players playing their crazy and kooky Wild decks actually have some kick, some punch to their deck type. So I would say overall the enjoyability of playing was certainly higher on Wild, especially leading up to rank 5 or so. I think once you hit rank 5 in Wild, most people are playing the very powerful, the very new, potent decks. But in Standard, that seems to stop around rank 20. So it's a lot more play, it's a lot more rank progression in Wild versus Standard. There's also a lot more players playing Standard, and because there's a lot more games happening, the natural push of the win streak of the ladder system makes it a bit easier. So I think Standard, I think at the start of the month, it's probably harder because there's so many good players that got set back from the rollover in ranks. But later on in the months, I think, and most people I talk to agree, that Standard is probably a little bit easier to climb, at least in the first few ranks, while Wild, because it doesn't have as many players playing it right now, tends to not have as much of a progression. When I was hitting the low ranks of Wild in the last week or so, I would play a rank 5 opponent, next guy would be a rank 1, then a rank 4, then a legend. It would just be all over the place because there just weren't that many players at those ranks. And, you can imagine some of those players are pretty good. So if you're playing on a night where you're just playing the same few like legend players, even though you're like rank 4, it can be very difficult in Wild. So the experience, in addition to being more varied based on the deck type, I think in Wild you're also going to have a really large variation of skill type based on the day that you're playing. You might be playing on a good day, you might be rank 4 and you're playing just against rank 6 and 7 opponents. I didn't really experience that, but I imagine that can certainly be the case, especially early on in the month. So that's it. My recommendation is, if you have the card pool and you haven't tried it recently, Wild was an incredible experience for me. I found a deck I really like to play, and you guys know me. It's hard for me to find something I like to play, and Wild enables that more than Standard. And I really enjoy playing against a large variation of decks. I like to learn also what my opponents are doing and playing and thinking. And I also got a stronger and better experience playing Wild as well. So I was really blown away. I've kept advocating how this expansion has been so good in all the game modes that I've played. It's been great in Arena, fantastic in the Dungeon Run. The Tavern Brawls have been outstanding so far this expansion. And my first trip into Ladder playing Wild was really impressive. Now that I'm playing Standard, I actually think it's pretty decent. There are some really fun combo decks that I'm able to play, but a lot of those old factors of the same tier 1 net decks all through all the ranks seems to kind of demoralize my gameplay. So if you remember that being the case, a year ago or whenever the last time you played Standard, it's still like that today, but, at key times, on expansion launches, on nerf patches, on Standard resets, I think that all changes in Standard as well. So if you do want to have your bases covered, you can play Standard and have a lot of fun at these key intervals, but I would say you might enjoy Wild more than you think, especially in the low points in Hearthstone's game cycle. So that's it from me. Hopefully that gives you guys some guidance and maybe some interest in game modes you haven't played before. And I'll see you guys tomorrow.